Hello everyone. Happy, what day is it today? Monday? Monday. Happy Monday. Uh, I am here with Dr. Christian Brown, a good friend of mine from university. He's a psychiatrist now, actual real medical doctor. And oh, can you just say something so I can get your levels in?
Can you hear me?
Yep, a little bit more. What do you
Shall
have
I
for
carry on
breakfast?
talking?
Yeah, carry on saying nonsense. There we go. Actually, that's
Right.
good. Cool. So yeah, thank you. Christian, what do you do, and what are you doing at the moment?
So thanks for having me on this.
No worries.
It's with slight trepidation that I join you because I've never been on Twitch before, save for that slightly bumbled sort of attempt at watching your stream last week. This is definitely new. So yeah, I'm Christian. I'm a trainee psychiatrist, so a registrar in a field called forensic psychiatry, and I work in London. Forensic psychiatry, I guess, is where it's a treatment, assessment and treatment of mental disorder where that mental disorder is associated with some kind of risk to other people, and as such, there's a lot of sort of overlap with the criminal justice process. Forensic psychiatrists might work in prisons, secure hospitals, and go to court as expert witnesses. And at the moment, I'm working in a secure hospital. Um, and I really quite enjoy working in that sort of environment for all sorts of reasons. But that's basically my day job.
Awesome. So you are also doing some research on this topic, I believe. You have a recent paper out.
Well, yes, research is I guess a strong word, and I don't consider myself to be an expert by any means. What I think I am is a very interested observer who was oh, you mean in forensic psychiatry?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes,
Before we get
yes.
onto the AI stuff, this is I'm
Yeah.
showing.
So,
Sorry, I should have said I'm showing on
okay,
screen
okay. I
your
can't
recent
see what
paper,
you've got. I can't see what you've got on the screen.
International
So,
Journal of Law and Psychiatry paper.
yeah. So, yes. I've got a paper in press at the moment, which is I guess it does cover the crossover between mental health, the law, and ethics. Um, so the three areas that really come together very sort of fruitfully in forensic psychiatry. And it's been prepared in response to the COVID sort of situation, the pandemic, because we've been faced with this somewhat difficult situation on psychiatric wards, where our patients are um, probably very susceptible to getting COVID and then doing quite badly medically if they do get it.
Mm,
So they live in very close quarters. They have shared sort of living environments, and frankly, when people are very psychotic and very mentally unwell, personal hygiene is not usually absolutely top of their list, and maintaining
yeah.
some of the basic cleanliness that's so important for infection control is quite difficult to maintain. Also, we know that people with serious mental illness tend to, unfortunately, have quite poor physical health for a whole host of reasons. Certainly, there's a massive mortality difference of, I think, between 17 and 20 odd years
Mm,
between those in the sort of general population and those with what we might call serious mental disorders, say schizophrenia really being the sort of the main one, and certainly the main one that I come across in my own practice. Um, and a lot of the medications that we give have, can cause weight gain. And we learned over the last few months that being overweight is a significant risk factor for people who contract
mm,
COVID because of the difficulties in subsequent sort of ventilation. It seems to be a risk factor in its own right. But also, a lot of antipsychotic medication is an independent risk factor for developing severe chest infections anyway. So all of this is like a really horrible
yeah.
situation, actually. And it's something that I think, need to take incredibly seriously in terms of infection control. and making sure that we're doing everything that we can for our patients in terms of keeping them safe and stopping the infection from spreading. Um, Now, there's a whole sort of gamut of measures that you can take in terms of restrictions on liberty, because
Mm,
a subset of what we will do in terms of infection control will be infringements on liberty, a bit like all of us being told to stay at home. In the ward, there will be limitations on who's coming and going, how much contact people can have with each other. And in kind of extremis, you might end up in a situation where somebody is asked not to, say, leave their room if they have confirmed COVID or if they've got suspected COVID, because you don't want it to spread to everyone else
of
on the ward.
course.
Now, I've got to sort of stress that this is a, you would end up with that kind of you'd end up with considering isolation only if absolutely nothing that was less sort of restrictive was likely to work, and there were all sorts of other sort of measures. So cohorting of patients onto special COVID wards where everybody's a confirmed suspected case, and therefore it's less important to kind of restrict people's liberty as much as keeping them in the room. But
Sure.
anyway, if you get to the situation where somebody is isolated, then there's what we think is an interesting legal question, certainly um, what we conclude in the paper, an unresolved legal question as to the legality of isolating them at all. Because and to kind of cut a very long paper short, um, I think the question comes down to there are two sort of possible answers. There's mental health legislation and there's public health legislation. And mental health legislation doesn't seem like the right kind of law to protect and safeguard public health.
Yeah.
It seems like a stretch, possibly a stretch too far, even for an act as malleable as the
Mm,
Mental Health Act, which tends to get used for all sorts of reasons. I think that's just a sort of a comment on, it's a slightly cynical comment on the reality of
yeah.
its use. Um, and public health law is essentially not very practical to use in mental health settings. So what it does is it makes it it makes it possible to create an offence not to comply with a public health officer's mandate to stay in your stay in a particular place. Now, if somebody is very psychotic, very thought disordered, um, then not only is it quite unlikely that and the power to enforce that sits either with the police or with the public health officer, and it can't be delegated, as far as we can tell, to the mental health provider, the hospital.
Mm.
So either you have a policeman on the ward all the time, and this would be, I think, scary and awful
Challenging. Yeah.
for in a mental health setting, and sort of we don't really want that.
No.
But then there are these two problems. So there's how do you enforce it, particularly when people are lacking in capacity with regards to that decision and probably thought disorder, and will find it difficult to kind of comply with that sort of order. And also, should we be using the criminal paradigm to address this problem? And so, so we've got public health legislation, which sounds like the right sort of law in theory to keep people safe, because it's risk to others, it's public health.
Yeah.
And also, it would be what you might argue that it's disability neutral. Like, it would seem sort of wrong, probably, to use the Mental Health Act for this, because it means that those detained in psychiatric hospitals are potentially subject to, I mean, they are anyway, I mean, I guess that's the reality, but, subject to an additional set of restrictions that people in, say, care homes or living at home, you're right, are not subject to. So using public health law would be disability neutral to a much greater degree. But in its present form is completely useless. And in the Mental Health Act, you can use it. Probably that's our conclusion, but it's a bit of a stretch. And it doesn't fit the situation particularly
Yeah.
well. But it's probably the best for a bad bunch of bits of law that we've got at the moment. Anyway, I know we're meant to be talking about
No,
psychiatry.
no, that it's very interesting, and I think it's something that generally speaking underlines the fact that across pretty much all of society across the world, we've been radically underprepared for the challenges, the like practical day-to-day challenges that are imposed upon us by a major quarantine.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of stuff. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the continuity of government planning in the US, but there's this whole cascade of like legal framework, a lot of which has been worked out very secretively, that gets put into place in the event of, a nuclear war, or the California falling into the ocean, or something like that. Um, but we haven't had the same level of planning for some events that are arguably more likely and
Yeah,
were certainly foreseeable. Um, so, person in chat here, Neon Golden, says, I was just going to say public health makes sense, as then everyone is having to follow the same guidelines of self-isolating, but very complex case. And yeah, I think that's what Christian was kind of speaking to, is the fact that if you're going the public health route, as I understand it, you're not discriminating on the basis of a what is ultimately like a protected group, of disability status, or at least it's a protected group legally in the US. I'm not sure exactly how UK law works there, but
yeah.
yeah, it's certainly a very complex case.
It is, and I feel like I need to just stress once more,
Please do,
if
please do.
it wasn't clear, that this kind of approach to the problem is a deeply sort of academic one, and not a clinical one at all. You don't sit in hospital and think, I've decided to, you know, lock this person up. What kind of legal excuse do I need to do so?
Yeah.
That kind of the device that we use in the paper is to kind of, assume the worst, and then just
Yeah.
think through some of the principles, and ask what the legal and we think political questions are around, because we need some sort of, I don't think that the answers to this can be resolved on the facts. I think that's quite an important sort of point to stress.
Yeah.
And as such, it doesn't seem like something that you could, uh, you know, um, yeah, you can't come to it by science. The civil service probably shouldn't be making these sorts of decisions. I think it needs a little bit of political leadership. It might not be absolutely top of their agenda at the moment, but I think we need that sort of leadership.
Um,
Um,
so apparently,
um,
mental health is a protected characteristic in the UK under the 2010 Equality Act. So there we go.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely, yes.
uh, Another question from chat. So what's being done practically at the moment regarding this current situation with the quarantine lockdown? What's the
It's a
status on the
good,
ground?
yeah, it's a good question. It, I think the sort of the short and really unsatisfying answer is that it'll depend on the hospital, and it might depend to some degree on the doctors or nurses or managers involved, because there is a lack of central guidance, or the guidance that
Mm,
we do have centrally is vague enough that it can be, it's widely interpretable. Um, my understanding is that guidance will come at some point from the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, who have some duties in sort of overseeing and reviewing the use of the Mental Health Act, which gives you some idea that it might be that the Mental Health Act is being recommended for use in terms of the legal justification for these things. But I think that um, I mean, I guess clinically, if you've got somebody on your ward who is coughing and has a fever, and you do, and you've done a swab and you're waiting for the result,
yeah.
you would ask them to isolate in their room if they, and sort of see if they will cooperate with that request. And if they don't, then I guess that's, not to try and sound too euphemistic, that's a sort of discussion you've got to have with them. And I think the kind of the complexity of these situations that doesn't come through in the sort of paper that we wrote around about this is that, you have a relationship with the patient, and you're constantly sort of putting to them sort of what you hope is a reasonable position,
Yeah.
and trying to explain to them, and then sort of try and work to some sort of reasonable reasonable kind of outcome. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the setting. So in
Mm,
forensics, our hands are tied by the fact that our patients, generally, we can't discharge them. But it might be that for somebody who's on the ward for something that they might have had treatment at home, but they preferred to be on the ward, that developing COVID would be quite a good reason to go home, so that they don't sort of, infect other people. So
yeah.
discharge might be an option, and then to receive treatment, sort of, either by telephone. It's just sort of I guess the answer is it depends on the setting. There isn't any central guidance. There's no kind of like there's no definitive answer, and our paper is a cry for help, really, um, asking for a bit more guidance so that we, because if it's being done differently everywhere, then there's another problem, isn't there, which is that it's unfair
Mm.
um, for patients in different parts of the country or even different parts of, say, the same town um, to be subject to very different sort of care, levels of care and also levels of restriction.
Yeah.
So I think there's a sort of a justice point as well. I can see some of these questions as well. So
Yeah.
what's number exactly at the moment? Yes, yes, the answer you expected. Absolutely. I agree. Um, and in Avon and Wiltshire, I think they've gone for having separate wards for anyone testing positive. Yes, so I know that there has been, or at least I believe that there's been a national directive to work towards cohorting, and in fact, in mental health environments to try and emulate what they've got in physical health hospitals, which is to have green areas and red areas. Red being places where you have confirmed COVID, and green areas where you don't. Now, there's a whole discussion that I'm not qualified to have around the sort of reliability of testing and how frequently you'd need to be testing and how cautious you need to be in order to
Mm.
kind of really maintain red and green in the middle of a pandemic. Um, but um, but yeah, there are
Yeah.
various different approaches being suggested.
Certainly, my understanding is that that's becoming more viable as the quality of both the PCR and the antibody tests is gradually increasing.
Yeah,
Um, the latest antibody tests being rolled out are quite remarkably effective, which is nice.
it's
A
good.
little
It's
bit of
good
ray
because
of
they have to be,
sunshine.
don't they?
Yeah, they really do.
um,
Yeah. Uh, so, I figure we'll move on to the main thing that you actually came on to talk about. That was a very interesting little diversion, which is the other paper you wrote, or more of a sort of debate article,
yes.
um, which is about entitled provocatively. Well, you were arguing the proposition of, will artificial intelligence eventually replace psychiatrists? So this is a debate that more generally the idea of machines replacing the human workers is something that comes up frequently, but it's often stated that things like acting and social care and psychiatry will be things that, because they're so intrinsically human, because they're so deep core to our emotions and the things that it means to be human, are things that are going to be the last to be replaced, if ever. Um, but you and Giles William Story argue that, uh, well, I'll let you present your own argument. What do you argue?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I can imagine that there are people interested in AI who will read that title, see that we're trying to argue something, but neither. Well, so I'm very grateful to my co-authors. So everybody else, in fact, on both papers that I've now published, the AI one and this the isolation one, I'm the least qualified person on either author list to kind of talk about the subject. But I've kind of convened the paper or the debate in both instances out of just pure
I've
interest.
got a couple of
But
papers like that. It's good, isn't it?
but I think yeah. So I don't have any particular experience in machine learning, AI, anything like that, except for kind of like a keen amateur sort of spectate. It's like a spectator sport to me, kind of like reading what people are saying about this. And what I found quite interesting is that nobody seemed to be talking an awful lot about AI replacing psychiatrists in the way that they do talk about AI replacing radiologists or kind of I don't know, even primary care or oncology,
Oncologists, yeah.
um, uh, because I think there's this kind of like assumption that psychiatry is the safest of all professions, and I think that that's a really, as soon as there's this kind of like unspoken assumption, that's something you've got to question
Mm.
and think about, because at some point we'll be taken by surprise. Anyway, the title I know will make some people groan, and I think that it's important to kind of just say quickly what we're not talking about and what we weren't trying to say, which is when this will happen. Um, we don't know. And for the questions that we're trying to think about, or certainly the ones that I find interesting, I don't think it matters. I think this is
mm,
more about principle. Um, and we are also, um, I guess, not that interested in whether or not you need to have human level intelligence, general, AGI,
mm,
in order to do this. I don't know, and it might be that relatively sort of primitive looking forms. I mean, I don't know how you sort of like measure it, but like relatively
mm,
primitive artificial intelligences will be able to do the job. It might be that you need remarkably sophisticated AIs to do the job. I don't know. And again, I don't think that that matters that
mm.
much for the kind of principled discussion that we wanted to
So
have.
this is something that Dr. Stuart Armstrong was saying last week when I had him on, is that his I think he said there's 90% confidence interval for when human level AI turns up is like 5 years to 100 years, and to some degree it doesn't really matter when it is in that timescale if not either side of it that it turns up because the questions are the same. It's just a case of how urgently do we need to answer them, and to some degree
Yeah.
because there's such uncertainty, it's probably prudent to start asking and answering them now just in case we're blindsided.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm watching. I'm watching the video on Twitch as well.
You've seen the delay,
So
so
I was sort of. I thought the sound had cut off, but actually you're just about 5 seconds behind. Yeah, yeah, completely agree. So I think an interesting, or it's an important question, without doubt. It's just one that I don't think. Well, I certainly can't answer.
mm,
Um, and as I say, I don't think it's too important for this particular debate. And then finally, the other thing that I guess we're not talking about, although I know that you spoke to some of the Wobot team
yeah,
today, is really the kind of the state of play today, because at least having said that, I don't think that unspoken assumptions are a good thing. I think that we can basically assume that there isn't a computer system out there that can replace a psychiatrist today, and
mm,
that there are certain kind of use cases for AI type techniques in the delivery of particular bits of psychiatric care. So
yeah.
I guess some kinds of computerized CBT via a chatbot, uh, drug sort of matching of person to sort of SSRI or particular kind of med that
So
you
there's
want to give.
a couple of things that chat brought up earlier. So
Yeah,
uh, AI Fred Health, which seems to be focused around kind of treatment assessment and delivery. Um, so doing some of the work that a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist would be contributing towards. Spring Health, which is doing similarly, taking a lot of different inputs and providing a variety of treatments there. And Wobot, I was chatting with earlier, and they're doing a chatbot that provides, as you say, kind of some CBT based therapy, taking some DBT techniques in there as well, which is obviously potentially very useful if we can get that kind of intervention very scalable and delivered to millions and billions of people worldwide who need it. That's fantastic, but we're still talking about, and Wobot, the folks from Wobot were saying this. We're not talking about applying deep machine learning techniques to immediately spit out conversations. It's using some of those techniques to analyze data and then having it filtered through uh, you know, more normal standards of care, or using it as an adjunct to more traditional standards of care currently.
yeah. And I think that in its, so the kind of transition that you can imagine possibly happening between what we have now and what we might have is a kind of an interesting one to think about.
Mm,
Um, and a phrase that we sort of, or a kind of idea that we put into this paper was the idea that the human is just the front end to some machine um, operating system, right? And the if a computer was calling all the shots, and I think that this probably extends beyond psychiatry as well,
mm,
um, people might rightly ask why have the middleman? Um, and there might be really good reasons for that, and I don't want to, and I think that those good reasons are worth exploring. But I imagine that at least for some people that would feel weird and artificial,
mm,
and probably expensive and a waste of resources if they could, get it from a horse's mouth, as it were. Um, but exactly what the world will look like when AI is, and I think this is a matter of time, just to nail my colours to the mast.
mm,
What the world will look like at that point will be vastly different, and the job of the psychiatrist might be quite, will probably be markedly changed. So we're talking about a world where people will have the AI psychiatrist probably isn't someone who you only see once every 6 months and for half an hour, and they have to catch up with the notes, sort of, rapidly before seeing you in
Are
clinic.
you subtweeting my diabetic psychiatrist? Psychologist. Anyway.
um, um, yeah, so the kind of the world that we're talking about, I don't, there are no kind of like really um, obvious analogies, I don't think,
mm,
between how care is provided now and how care is likely provided in the future. But I think there are some interesting questions. And I guess top of the list for me would be, will people accept psychiatric care from non-human agents? And I say non-human rather than artificial because
mm,
I think it just widens the issue a bit. And I guess makes the point about humans being human,
mm.
and perhaps that being quite important to people. Obviously, we don't argue this. We're arguing that AI will, should, etc.,
Yeah.
take our jobs. But it might be the case that people want a human just because they're human,
Mm.
and there's a sort of slightly speciesist sort of bent there. Um,
Well,
but
that
anyway,
raises potentially interesting questions about the ethics of tricking humans into believing that they're being treated by humans when they're actually being treated by
yeah,
AIs.
didn't even consider that.
I'm just thinking about how to monetize this. Uh, um, so we've got a couple of comments here from J Tibbs. Um, the first one, I think you'll probably empathise with. And
Yes.
depending on how you try to integrate AI, doctors will push back even if AI objectively better at the task. Apparently, you have to make AI more like a spell checker for doctor's decision to. So I think that's a potentially interesting topic. Is the kind of, are we going to see Luddism in both the medical profession and in society, of people who say it's you need the authenticity for the experience to be valid.
Yeah. So, authenticity is a really interesting word. And also, to answer your first sort of question, the
Mm.
kind of will we see Luddism? The answer is yes. We- all the time.
That's a pretty safe bet. Fair.
That we can say with certainty. Um, and what I think we see is loads of slightly, I don't know if the term quite is post hoc reasoning
Mm.
around the intuition that AI can't do it, but maybe that is the term. And one slight jibe that we make in our paper is the suggestion that I think people say, well, if the AI is too smart, then people won't trust it. But if it's not
Mm.
intelligent enough, then it's not going to be able to do the job. And it's like, so you're saying that it has to have just the right level of intelligence in order to kind of like function properly. And that just seems like too perfect
Mm.
or too coincidental an arguments, and I think also ignores, I don't know,
Well, we
it,
don't
it
know our psychiatrist's intelligence when we speak to them anyway. We're like, it's not like I go to a prospective psychiatrist and go, okay, well, okay, you've got a degree from Harvard and one from Oxford, but here's an IQ test.
No, I mean it's. I think
It's
it's a weird argument, and I think the formulation of the argument, not too much, not too little,
yeah,
suggests that post hoc reasoning going on.
yeah,
And yes, I think looking at Jacob's first comment about even after psychiatrists are replaced, they'll still argue that they're better than AI because of intangible things. I think that's entirely right.
mm,
And I guess so just to lay out some of the structure of our argument in the paper, we kind of say that there are technical aspects of the job and there are relational aspects of the job. And it doesn't really matter what the terminology is. Basically, there are things like drug discovery, drug selection, diagnosis, and treatment selection for those people, which we think that it's kind of obvious. You probably don't even need sort of AI to do these things better. You just need sufficiently kind of well curated sort of data sets and to kind of
Yeah.
like work things out uh, and we think it's not going to be too much time until well yeah it's
Though,
probably not
so
going to be
those
too
are
much
probably
time
going to
until
be
the technical
solved with,
aspects are kind of like done better. But
yeah,
people always say that psychiatry is more than just technical stuff, right? It's also all the relational aspects, kind of creating a relationship with your patient, kind of, you can't just ask somebody a question and expect them to tell you the answer, right? Particularly in psychiatry. I mean, something that our opponents in the debate point out is that, at least in some of the theory, what you're trying to do in therapy is trying to unearth things that the patient might not sort of have acknowledged even to themselves. So,
yeah.
you don't go to somebody who's in crisis and say, what's going on and expect them just to give you a nice neat
Why are you so sad?
yeah quite
It's not.
and that there's something really kind of important about being human in that relationship. Now some people would say and we sort of argue that it's surely only a matter of time until the actual ability to probe for that kind of information in a sensitive and empathetic way will be doable by machines.
Mm,
And I think for two reasons. One, machines will get better, and two, I think we probably, and this is just like an intuition that I have, I think that we overestimate the complexity of our own sort of communication.
mm,
Um, and when you look at like the sorts of the ways that we anthropomorphize completely inanimate things around us, and I don't know, loads of examples of this, I
mm.
guess, all the way through, through history. Um, then I don't think it's going to take too much for people to kind of form reasonably, okay relationships with artificial agents.
Mm.
And
Well,
I
so
don't know.
this is something that came up in our discussion with Wobot earlier. Was that I didn't look into the studies that they were referencing, but apparently this has been looked into a fair bit, and people tend to be substantially, particularly men who have, somewhat of a problem with sharing some stereotypically in society due to, social norms and so forth. They found that the in conversations with, a private Facebook bot, people were substantially more open than they tend to be in conversations with a human, which potentially raises, privacy issues of what if people are, because the AI is necessarily going to be, or the artificial agent is necessarily going to be storing that data in some sense that is probably more easily retrievable than from the psychiatrist's brain. It's going to be storing it more literally and in a way that'll probably end up getting shared in different data sets. But yeah, generally speaking, it seems to be, at least based on what they were saying. I need to
And
look into it
yeah,
in depth. Yeah.
I think we cite one or two examples of studies where they've shown people are more honest with artificial agents, or
Mm,
sort of on question. I think if somebody just sits there and asks you how much booze do you get through in a week,
mm,
you might
yeah.
try and give a good impression. Whereas if you're just putting something on a piece of paper, forget AI,
Mm,
you might end up being more honest. And I know that there is some data around the computer agents getting more honest things in certain circumstances. And I think you just think about what people type into Google compared to what they ask their GPs. Um, it's People are very, very open with these things that they don't think are judging them,
mm,
and I guess something that you really just can't get away from with human interaction is the idea that the other person is perceiving you and probably evaluating you in some meaningful way that you care about, and that could potentially shut down conversation.
mm,
And I think that which situations a human's going to be better at than others. I don't really have a good heuristic for trying to for knowing which is which. And I guess what we're doing slightly is falling into um, the problem of just sort of talking about psychiatry as a big old
mm,
umbrella term. It's obviously huge, and people present with all kinds of things to their psychiatrists and to mental health services. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I guess it's anyone's guess what an artificial agent would be, better at getting. But
Mm.
it might be that they're able to sort of elicit um, information sensitively and form kind of therapeutic relationships. Anyway, I was interested in the next the there was some more comments. Um,
Oh yes, couple from Neon Golden.
yes, has been any work asking psychiatric patient groups to often have a lot of negative? Yeah, of course, negative association with psychiatrists and their previous care, with the idea of AI.
That's a really
Um,
good question.
yeah, and I think this is the other line of argument that we make slightly cynically about AI psychiatry, is that I think all these people saying, "Oh no, machines can't do a better job than can't do a better job than humans," slightly overestimate how good a job humans are doing in the first place.
Early 20th century psychiatry.
and and I think some of that is to do with I guess the state of the science. Some of it's
Mm,
to do with people being you know uh, flawed and fallible. Um, but I think a lot of it is to do with systems, and I want to do just say something that'll take about a minute. It's a bit
please do,
laborious.
please do.
um,
Unpack away.
but if somebody felt, um, um, I don't know, suicidal at 2 in the morning, they might call 111, explain to one person and then another person exactly how they feel, and then get transferred over to 999 or have a paramedic sent round to their house. They have two strangers enter their house, ask them all the same questions: why are you feeling suicidal, or why did you do that? Which is quite intrusive
Mm,
anyway. They get taken to A&E. They might see a triage nurse, an A&E doctor, and then a psychiatric, junior doctor who will say, well, it seems that, I mean, this is conceivable, but you're pretty risky. You weren't safe at home. We think you should come into hospital. And also, we're so concerned about your situation that we think that we don't really want to let you go home.
mm,
And so we're going to do a mental health assessment, at which point you see three more people, a specialist social worker, two independent doctors, and you probably have the home treatment team come along anyway, because
mm,
they're obliged to think about what the least restrictive option is. So they've got to consider home treatment. But then they get admitted to hospital, so they have to wait for another ambulance, another couple of paramedics who ask, "What's going on tonight? How are you feeling?"
yeah.
And it's like, "How do you think that I'm feeling?" And then they get to the hospital, where they have to get clocked in by another doctor, meet another set of nurses who are working the night shift, and then in the morning they get to meet the nurses on on the ward team, and their normal doctors, who will ask them all the same questions. And I
Mm,
don't know how many times over that night they've been asked the same questions by people who they don't know, and yet we still put psychiatric care, in its present form, in the
mm.
systems that we deliver it, above like all sorts of other sorts of possibilities. And I don't know. I just don't think that we should overestimate the quality of the service that we provide. And also, people say, I guess the other issue here is about trust, and the people say, we trust humans, we won't trust computers. Now, we've already kind of touched on this in terms of what people will
Mm.
put into Google versus tell their doctors. But an artificial agent has the possibility, at least, of actually earning your trust by knowing you over the course of years and years, or at least months and years, not
Yeah.
being somebody who flits into your life for a mere minute, or mere hour or two, and then out again. And I think that it's slightly hubristic to expect somebody to trust a complete stranger who turns up in their house at 3 in the morning, um, where actually they you know uh, yeah, I don't know. I won't finish that thought,
No,
but
I think that's a very valuable thought. So, but from my personal perspective, I've been through several different counselors, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and so forth. And certainly, it takes a very long time to build up that level of not just trust, because I'm generally confident that they're not going to, go sharing my secrets or whatever, but the level of comfortableness just being around someone and knowing that if you say something, they won't react in a weird way, or they'll not read too much into it or too little into it, and just this kind of uh, gradual acclimatization that even an agent that behaves less human than a human is kind of less effective in certain regards. I think that wealth of evidence, not just from your conversations with it, if you have a short chat with this chatbot multiple times a week, or a few times a day when you're in a particularly bad space, but also being able to check your emails if you give it access to that, take account of your social media posts, and essentially be doing far more research on you than any psychiatrist could ever do without having you as their only patient who, they social
Yeah,
media stalk all the time.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, it gets dystopian pretty quickly, and
yeah, this is true.
that
Well, that's the thing. It's not a dystopia and it's not a utopia, and I can't remember there's a name for the kind of mix of the two, the in between. But I think it's the reason why it's emblematic of the reason why I am, and many people far smarter than me on the topic are concerned about artificial intelligence and human level artificial intelligence that is capable of acting on the world in a very powerful, very effective manner. Gathering up all kinds of information and putting them together into a model that far surpasses any that we could generate internally. And that is scary, and there's a lot of risk associated with that. Just the kind of cybersecurity privacy part of me goes, all this data, if an attacker gets access to that, that's really bad.
yeah.
But the the opportunity for that is absolutely incredible. And I guess the question becomes what sort of things, and I'm not asking you to provide a roadmap or anything, but what sort of things can we do to make sure that we get more of the you and less of the dis in Artopia?
Yeah. Um, I mean, that's obviously a huge question,
Yeah.
and I think I think being mindful of some of the sort of AI safety work that's already going on. I mean, there are presumably principles that are generalizable from that,
Mm, we
and
hope
I
so,
think
at
that
least.
there can be um, a tendency to try and reinvent the wheel for every new subject that you come across, and like issues around privacy, how you deal with, uh, you know, um, uh, how do you really anonymize kind of data sets when they're so
Mm,
when they're so huge and detailed that actually you can drill that potentially drill down and get a lot of identifiable stuff out of them. I don't know, like there are problems that seem to be need to be solved on a very principled level, and then in terms of how this might translate to psychiatry, or psych specific stuff. um, um, there's um, I don't know. I mean, there's something about always bringing people kind of along with you. I mean,
mm,
I'm not biggest fan of leaving this all to companies to sort of try and innovate their way into. I think this is the domain of proper science
mm.
and should be sort of government funded research, or at least sort of like welcome collection funded
Yeah,
research.
yeah.
Some sort of relatively interested and competent party that's not in it for sort of snappy slogans, over promising and whatnot. Now, obviously, there are really good companies out there doing good work, but it seems to me that the promises of digital psychiatry will get
Mm,
fulfilled when you have really good integration between the health service and the digital agent. And I don't see some of these, particularly in the NHS, I don't see these companies as being particularly well placed to integrate in that sort of way. Now,
mm.
I mean, I don't really know what the answer to this is, and I couldn't really define even that problem better than I'm doing at the moment. Um, but yeah, I'm just looking at some of it. There's a lot of comments. It's really cool.
Yeah, should we go back to chat because I think this is the liveliest chat's been for me, so I'm very much enjoying
Excellent.
this. Um,
In reality, some of these emotions could be good and bad. Yes, yes. Okay, just going to be much more volatile and less predictable in outcome. Yeah. So there was an interesting thing in one of the discussions that I had leading up to this, and this will sound like a really really strange thing to say, but and actually, there's been an insight into this with all the telemedicine that's going on during COVID. But there was somebody who I spoke to in the lead up in the preparation of the debate said that the thing about being in the room with somebody is that you could actually get into a fight with them. You could do them some damage, right? There are the act of physically being present
Mm,
in a room means that there is potential to that situation that simply isn't the case if you're not there.
yeah.
And I guess humans with all their sort of lives around them, there's a lot at stake. They have values and things that they want and places to go to after work and whatnot. And that obviously a lot of, well, I say obviously, so at least it's possible that a lot of conversation that you have, possibly stuff that happens in therapy, is sort of symbolic of other sorts of things that might be going on in the room, sort of subconsciously or some kind of on some level. And yeah, I know that you're making a slightly different point there, but the kind of the volatility, the emotionality of that interaction is arguably really really important, and would be something that again there's a question as to whether you could reliably reproduce that, or whether whether people buy the authenticity of an otherwise
Mm.
authentic seeming artificial agent. Um,
Or indeed whether the lack of such kind of potential threat makes people more willing to open up. In terms of trolls online, the anonymity and disconnect from another person afforded by their position seems to give people greater emotional openness or willingness to share their views, which in the case of online trolls, not so good, but potentially in the case of mental health treatment, it might be healthy.
well,
I don't know.
um, yeah, I'm just picking through these comments. I'm also I keep on falling foul of this video lag issue. So I'm sorry. I probably
It's
shouldn't be
okay.
watching the Twitch stream at the same time. Good points about the flaws in the system. Absolutely. Same with self-driving cars. And yeah, um, yeah, I could completely agree. Um, Humans have lots of biases which could transfer to AI. But if we avoided this pitfall, AI could help work around. Again, to go back to your question earlier about how we make sure that AI psychiatry is done right and we get
Mm,
utopia, not a dystopia. That the bias issue is like it is the more I think about it, the more it sort of mangles my brain because it's really really hard. It's a really
mm,
hard one to fix. But like again, I think this is quite similar to the public health versus mental health law in the isolation paper, in that what we consider to be biases that we shouldn't. This is just my kind of like take on
mm,
it. The biases that we care about reducing are I don't think that they're things that we can kind of like look at science and say, oh, well, here are some things that are objectively bad to discriminate against. I think these are value led,
mm,
positions where we say, well, for no scientific reason do we discriminate. Should we not discriminate against someone? But this is something that if we're to be good people,
mm.
and this is a silly sort of uninformed take on morality, I guess, but if we're to be good people, we ought not to do this. And it's I think it's I don't really know much about how it is that an artificial system. I know that there is work on this, but I
Mm.
don't know how they go about deciding what sorts of bias are
So one of
acceptable.
the one of the big ways that you can avoid it is, I believe, obviously not expert, etc., but is using larger and more equally weighted data sets. So a lot of the bias in machine vision research has been the fact that if you train a machine learning algorithm on a data set from Facebook, it'll be a bias towards white people, older people, so it'll be much better at discriminating between those faces, but have a harder time picking up the ones it hasn't been trained on as much. Um, So by using more representative data sets, that could help, but I know there are a bunch of ways that bias can get ingrained in these systems.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the positive or the optimistic outlook is that over the last few years, the effectiveness of machine learning researchers at training algorithms to be less biased has been far more rapid than social psychologists and uh, politicians and activists' efforts have been to change human perceptions of bias. That's a multi-decade to century thing, whereas the algorithms seem a bit more amenable to updates. Um,
Yeah, it's just that I mean, I guess you hear these sort of nightmare scenarios, don't you, where people have
mm,
like prematurely deployed some algorithm that's just ended up being horrible,
yeah,
horribly sort of racist, ageist, sexist, all sorts of sort of Amazon
yeah,
hiring.
mm,
The parole? Was it parole? Was it Compass or something like that in the States? I can't remember the name of it, but these awful things. And
mm,
well, I'm sort of heartened to hear that there's progress made on bias, but I think that underlying this is quite an interesting question of ethics.
mm,
Basically, the technical and the ethical questions are separate, and I think it's quite important to separate those out um, because yeah, I doesn't keep qualifying. Um, um, Positive AI in addressing bias in a general sense situations like lack of cultural sensitivity affecting poor diagnosis in ethnic minorities, widespread training of all psychiatrists. Is perhaps more difficult having, yeah. So I mean, I'm a real optimist about this stuff, and I think that AI at least it stands to reason that it could do a better job than
mm,
humans. Not least because I think as a training at the moment, nearing-ish the end of my training, so I'll be
mm.
all going well consultant next year. Um,
Fingers crossed.
uh, I haven't, compared to psychiatrists of old, as it were.
Mm,
I don't think I've seen all that many patients. Like, I mean, I have a for the moment relatively small board. They're people who I get to know really, really well,
yeah.
but I don't see loads and loads and loads of people, and so I'm not generating particularly sort of big data sets. And I can learn certain things from books and from papers and whatnot, but there's something to be said for some of you know people in bygone years would have seen thousands and thousands of people in there. I'm not saying this is in any way a good thing, but in terms
Mm,
of learning, they would have seen thousands of people every year in their institutions, and that's the sort of that's the kind of training that humans aren't going to get, and I don't know. I mean, I don't even know that that's necessarily better for bias, but on a kind of learning point, at least in theory, computers will be able to learn quicker than humans. I don't know.
yeah. And
Um,
they'll be able to apply actual statistical tests so that the psychiatrist who has seen a cluster of X patients, so thinks that X patients are representative of the wider group. Hopefully, there'll be less chance of that as long as we sanitize and scrub the inputs properly, because there's always the risk of more research focusing on kids from top flight universities. Therefore, all of our psychology research uh, predicts nothing about anyone except for kids from top flight universities.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And to the point about that in terms of understanding why
mm,
um, bias happens, and not being able to do that for humans. Again,
mm,
this is one of those um, things where people, I think, routinely um, over egg the sort of benefits of a human system
mm.
as opposed to some sort of AI or machine system.
Well,
Um,
J-Thibs brings up this in the context of the justice system.
yeah, yeah.
You can tell it was biased for X reasons and then correct for it.
Yeah,
And
at least
yeah,
I guess at least in theory, and what you need there for are decent systems that are human readable, or that you can
yeah,
actually meaningfully interrogate, which is as I understand it not always the case. Um,
yeah.
um,
It can be tricky to do, but it's something that is certainly important in cybersecurity generally. I wonder if we'll develop, or is something I'm kind of interested in exploring, is this relationship between um, traditional implementations of security and security and safety around use of algorithms that interface with our society and our health states in meaningful ways. But yeah, you can't go back and ask a judge exactly why did you make this judgment. Okay, they can maybe go through a like sentencing algorithm and say, well, the offence was in this category and it had this mitigating circumstance and so forth. But their actual mental processes, they don't know whether they had had a bad cheese sandwich earlier in the day and that was making them, less predisposed to hearing the defendant out or whatever.
Well,
Um,
absolutely, and I think yeah, uh, yeah, you make the point very well. People don't know why they do things, I don't think. Um, and in some cases, sometimes they know perfectly well why they did something, but they know that
mm,
it's not for a particularly good reason. But they know what you want to hear, and they know
yeah.
what an acceptable narrative sounds like and what an unacceptable narrative sounds like.
And
And so
sometimes
you,
they come to believe that, even
and then
though they know
yeah,
they're lying initially. But memory gets rewritten.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, not that any of these problems are necessarily insurmountable in machines,
Mm,
which may very well learn what we want to hear. But yeah, yeah, how you solve this problem is, as I say, quite beyond me. I mean, one thing that we haven't, I think, touched on, but
mm,
is sort of, at least I don't think that we've touched on it, is just if this stuff does work, even if it's not particularly good, if it's really cheap and it's accessible all
yeah.
the time, um, then not only will it, these technologies avail themselves to far more people than currently have
Mm,
access to high or reasonable quality mental health care. We're talking about a kind of a global context here.
mm,
But I think people will just quite happily use it. I mean, I'm sort of I kind of think if somebody was given the choice, you can see an artificial um, agent, and it's free.
mm,
And to the best of scientific knowledge, they make perfectly good personalized diagnoses at a much greater degree of sophistication and based on more information than a human counterpart, and their patients who see them, their treatment responses tend to be better than the human counterparts. um, but they will just be a virtual agent who you interact with as an avatar on your phone,
mm,
or audio something or another. um, or you can pay money to see a human who will not be quite as good, etc., etc., etc.
yeah. Yeah.
I think that most people will just go for the artificial agent without thinking too much about it. Now, just because modern medicine exists, or just because the kind of medicine that we practice in the NHS exists, doesn't mean that other forms of medicine, sort of other sorts of more sort of spiritual kind of approaches, um, are not available. They are available.
Mm.
People do go and ask that kind of stuff. And I wonder whether human psychiatrists will be sort of pushed into that bracket at some point in the future.
That's an
Um,
interesting question. Um, and yeah, I think even if if we have an intervention that costs you know £5,000 per year to keep patients on it and improves their condition by 60%, and one that improves their condition by 40% but costs £50 a year, I think a lot of healthcare services and a lot of people, if they're paying for their own treatments, are going to make the decision to go with the latter. Um, Not least because there's a good chance that it'll increase in quality far faster than the traditional option would.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this gets into a whole a whole other sort of debate about health economics, doesn't
Well,
it?
yeah, yeah. Which I'm always interested in, but I think it's certainly from kind of global health perspective, the opportunity here, even if we're only producing marginal improvements in people's quality of life, most of the world has a cell phone now, so a online chatbot based treatment would be extremely cheap to roll out and could potentially uh, alleviate a huge amount of suffering for people who just can't.
Yeah, So I think the thing that I'm sure is sort of obvious to all but the most cynical of sort of listeners is that the idea, because I think there is this, I think there's this worry that when we talk about global health, you sort of export poor quality and you
Mm,
say, well, it's better than nothing. The idea here would be obviously to create a decent piece of software that works and is validated,
mm,
and then gets properly validated elsewhere as well. Given that population differences are
yeah,
super important not to kind of overlook. But that once you have a workable system that's actually of a really good quality, then it being based in in computers rather than in human resources will be much much cheaper and easier to kind of distribute. Um, but yeah, not to fall into the kind of the medical student trap of
no,
going to Africa for your elective
no.
um, and yeah, I mean
I mean,
I
it's a difficult debate because, or a difficult kind of distinction because I think there are certainly standards of care, or there are certainly instances where we should accept a lower standard of care because it's cheaper. If you look at I don't know, treatment for AIDS, you don't get surgical interventions for Kaposi's sarcoma or whatnot in the most of the developing world because the available resources are much lower, so they can't afford the most high-end treatments. But we should still accept some level of care, even if it's not the best. Um, but yeah, I think the problem really comes when it's pawning off low quality resources. Medical
yeah
students wanting to go off for a jolly, or
yeah
out of date pharmaceuticals,
yeah
that wouldn't be sold otherwise, that kind of thing.
yeah
That's when
yeah.
it becomes really troubling.
So yeah, perhaps something is better than nothing sometimes uh, is a reasonable phrase.
Yeah,
Um,
but we should try to do the best thing where we can, or something like
yeah,
that.
and I've just seen Jay Phillips saying an argument you'll hear
Yeah.
is that the ones who need the interventions most are too poor to own a cell phone, and I guess this is one of the sort of injustices of modern
Mm,
medicine, particularly outside of the NHS, outside the UK, where we're quite lucky to have sort of system that is at least in theory accessible by all. I know that in reality it's not, but yeah, the kind of new stuff tends to be expensive and tends to have a very select audience, and that's I guess one of the problems with. What we need to do is give them a cell phone. Yes, fair enough.
well, it's also something that's kind of under-recognized, um, which is in all but the very poorest regions, most people do have a cell phone. Smartphone ownership is still far from universal. Smartphone ownership is about 3.5 billion, so about 45%. But cell phone, uh, like dumb phone penetration, is really quite extensive. Though a lot of people that still don't have a personal one, it'll be shared between multiple members of the family or something like that.
Mm,
Um, but but yeah, for a lot of developing World Health interventions, using smartphone-based payments and tracking and so forth is actually really effective, because most people there don't have a laptop, but will have the cell phone for weather reports and keeping in
yeah,
touch and mobile banking stuff. Um, there's some interesting like text message based mobile banking options that have penetrated the developing world. Anyway, that's way off topic, but obviously the developing world isn't like one unitary uh, item, but yeah.
yeah,
Um,
um, yeah. Um, so anyway, I don't know quite what I managed to say of value
that was
about
very
AI.
interesting. I really enjoyed that. Uh,
um,
so, is there
uh,
anything else you want to kind of bring up, discuss?
um, No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess the one of the sort of draws for me in thinking about this is kind of wondering what I do in my work. Um,
What are
so
you even doing?
what even is it like that? What do I do? Like, And what's important, like, oh yeah, maybe there's one sort of
Yeah.
phrase that's worth mentioning, which is just, or one thought that's worth mentioning, which is that when I look around the multidisciplinary team at work, there are, psychiatric nurses, um, occupational therapists, psychotherapists who deliver the talking therapy, and a social worker and myself. And often the bit that I'm doing is the most technical bit.
Mm.
And I definitely feel in this debates context like the most expendable person in that room. There's no way that you're going to have robotic psychiatric nurses before you have artificially intelligent psychiatrists. Um, so maybe that's a good thought to sort of end on.
Well, you can fall back on philosophy at least if you if you have that.
Yeah, quite. So yeah, the question I should be asking myself is not when this is going to happen, but how do I retain a job when it does happen? So yeah, great. All right.
Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Laurie, for having me on this. It's been very
No,
interesting.
it's a pleasure.
And
It's
I
lovely.
should obviously thank my co-authors. I think I've already said that they're all far more expert than I am. You're the, the two very senior professors were on the other side of the debate to me and Charles. Charles does do computational psychiatry, so he's fantastically more qualified than I am about all of this anyway. But yeah, I don't know what that says. Um, but yeah, no, thanks, Laurie. This has been really good fun.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jay Thieber, for your excellent contributions. And Neon Golden, of course, as always. Lovely,
Yeah, thank
lovely
you.
contributions. Um, yeah, well, cheers, Christian, and I will see you in on.
Yeah, speak soon.
Bye.
All right, take care.